Between the original classic Doom and the most recent incarnation, Doom Eternal, there are a whole host of often forgotten games, and today we're taking a look at the Nintendo 64's entry into this mix. Hello there, welcome to saberduelgaming, where we always take the high ground, and welcome to our retro review of Doom 64. The original 1993 classic Doom was an amazing success on the PC and its ports eventually on numerous other consoles. But for the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, it was anything but. The port of the original Doom on the SNES was slow, laggy and very unresponsive, as well as having a lot of content missing. So whilst PC owners had Doom at its finest, along with numerous sequels, and even other home consoles had pretty damn good ports of it, Nintendo owners really probably didn't see what all the fuss was about. But when Doom 64 was released on the Nintendo 64 console, it finally gave Nintendo owners the opportunity to see their own real classic version of the game. The question was, by the time it was released, was this game really still their version of the classic that they were hoping for? Released in 1997 on the super successful Nintendo 64, this game was, whilst the second entry for Nintendo owners, the fourth entry in the game's franchise overall. Originally it was only released for the Nintendo 64, but has since been released across numerous other consoles. At this point, the Doom franchise is such an established part of gaming lore that pretty much everyone knows what these games are, but simply for the sake of completion, what is Doom 64? Well, put simply, Doom 64 is a first-person shooter game with slight elements of survival horror, to a degree, and puzzles thrown in. Your character, Doom Guy as he's generally known, is going to have to face up against zombified marines, floating flaming skulls, demons and various other monstrous things unleashed by hell itself. In the process, you will have to find a host of different colour-coded keys to unlock certain doors to work your way through the level and onto the next. Shockingly, whilst it really wasn't required, Doom 64 actually has a story as well. No, they didn't just throw you out there shooting things for the hell of it, you know. Hell being the operative word. The story for Doom 64 directly follows the events of Doom and Doom 2. In a nutshell, an entity known as the Mother Demon has resurrected all the monsters and beasts you've already killed, and you've got to go back in there and put them to their rest one more time. Believe it or not, there is actually a rather in-depth piece of lore describing these events in way more detail, but let's focus on the game review and keep it simple. The level design and graphical style of the game was generally the same. However, the Nintendo 64's powers and capacity allowed it to do certain things that the earlier versions hadn't. There were some very clear graphical changes though, and I don't just mean increases of frame rate or smoothness, but actual changes to certain designs. The most noticeable design changes were in the actual designs for a number of the monsters that we see across all Doom games, given completely different looks, as well as the weapons themselves. The weapon designs were only slight differences in some cases, but far more drastic changes in others. As with previous entries, it had a host of different game difficulties, with names designed to mock you for attempting to go for the easier ones, and to basically call you clinically insane and suicidal if you went for the harder difficulties. But that's just Doom for you. Despite all the graphical improvements, brand new levels, and other positive aspects, the one thing that was certainly missing from this game was a 2-player mode. Considering the Nintendo 64 had capacity for 4 people to play at once, this was going to be something that a lot of people missed. So, with that in mind, as well as everything else, how was this game received on its release? Well, there were a lot of areas in which Doom 64 received a lot of praise. First of all, the graphics. Everyone agreed, or at least all the reviews I could find, agreed that Doom 64 was quite possibly the best looking Doom game at this time. Even the graphics for the original 3 Doom games on the PC couldn't really compete with this. People did have slightly different perspectives on the redesigns, however. The redesign for the actual characters that we're fighting against and the weapons themselves. Some people, quite frankly, just didn't like the new looks. But even they couldn't argue with the actual graphics for these looks themselves. They just didn't like that the designs had changed. And then there was the level layouts. Again, these received drastic praise, not only for the fact that they were far more original layouts, but far more complex. Hell, certain switches, when pushed, would completely redesign the room around you, something that we'd never seen in the other Doom games. And then there was the audio. Most people commented that the audio was exceptionally good, and definitely felt like a Doom game, but to a whole other level. So you would assume that with all these factors in play, it got very, very good scores. There was nothing else that people could dislike about it, right? Not quite. You see, whilst it had so many elements that improved on what Doom had done, it still felt like the original Doom. Now, for some people, this was a positive. GamePro magazine, for example, specifically praised this game for not changing too much, for making it a pure Doom game, for keeping with the original style of gameplay. However, most other people found that it just hadn't changed enough. You see, by this time, and especially on the Nintendo 64, we'd seen a host of exceptional first-person shooters. Games like Turok, while flawed, gave us an awfully improved graphical style and new characters, new looks, new designs of levels, far more open worlds. And then there's a certain other game that was released the exact same year, a little game called GoldenEye 007, which quite frankly is possibly the greatest first-person shooter of all time. Certainly at this point, it left Doom and Doom 64 in many ways looking like an archaic Stone Age game. This game kept that pure feel of Doom, and a lot of people just thought it left it feeling outdated. In fact, Jeff Gerdston of GameSpot commented that whilst in many ways everything was perfect on paper, but in reality this felt like, and I quote, a bastardization of the original Doom. And the percentage scores for this game were all over the place. Some gave it scores in the mid to even high 80s, but the majority of the scores were in the mid 70s, and some scores were even in the low 40s. It was clearly a game that people just couldn't decide how it should actually be scored. In many ways it was the best of Doom, but Doom just wasn't the best anymore. So, how about modern scrutiny? How does this game hold up now? Well, it's quite interesting. I played this game on the Nintendo 64, having originally played Doom on the SNES. Doom on the SNES, as much as I wanted to love it, was, as we established earlier, really difficult to play. And playing Doom 64, I expected to go in and finally have that really positive Doom feel, but I didn't get it, because I'd already played Turok and GoldenEye, and those games were light years ahead of Doom 64, and Doom in general. They'd taken first-person shooters to a whole other level, and this game could not possibly have maintained the feel of Doom and competed with those games at the same time. But now, I actually appreciate it way more. You see, I'm going into this looking for a game that's retro, looking for a game that is the best version of a, yes, outdated type of game. Doom 64 is actually very enjoyable. In this particular way of looking at it, looking back for a retro game, what made it problematic at the time just isn't a factor now. The graphics are really beautiful, the weapons look really cool, and I'm not sat here comparing them to the weapons in the other game as to whether I preferred one over the other. I'm just looking at the game on its own. The level designs were a great deal of fun, really challenging at first, and once you got into it, played really well.
The only thing that even now I really can't forgive is the lack of a 2-player. The amount of fun I would have been able to have playing this as a 2-player on the Nintendo 64 is just next level. And as we were able to do it in GoldenEye, there's no reason why we couldn't have done it here. There were a few levels that come across as more annoying than challenging, but on the whole, that was always part of Doom's style. So how do we score it? Doom 64 is one of those rare games that has actually improved with age to some degree. It's garnered quite a cult following, and for me personally, it's probably a lot better now looking back on it than it was at the time. I think for me I'd give it a 7.5 out of 10, which is roughly what the average scores were at the time in fairness. And while I didn't really appreciate it at the time, as I think a lot of people didn't, I think now looking back, I can see that this is still a damn good Doom game and a good first-person shooter. And if you are a fan of Doom, you may first want to check out my retro review of the original Doom, as well as keeping an eye open for my upcoming Razoriz Retro set Doom Run No Gun Challenge coming this weekend. Razor had asked me to pick a challenge and I'd pick this one, setting this for the original Doom. He's already posted his attempt, as have numerous other YouTubers, so keep an eye out for these. And until next time, take the high ground.